I'm Hudson Hollister, the CEO of HData, and I'm very proud to be joined today by Jon Wellinghoff. Jon served as the chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission from 2009 until 2013 during the first half of the Obama administration. Previously held many roles across energy regulation, including serving as consumer advocate in the state of Nevada. Jon is now the CEO of GridPolicy, where he helps energy utilities and energy companies utilize new approaches and new technologies to make the energy sector work better. And in that capacity, he is an advisor to HData. Jon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Hudson. It's a great pleasure to be here. I really enjoy working with you and your company.
Jon, I'd like to brainstorm with you in this interview about how we can make the energy sector work better, in particular in the better exploitation of the data that's filed in FERC forms. Your former team at the FERC has been pushing to adopt the XBRL data format for FERC filings, replacing the current filing system, which is based on Microsoft Visual FoxPro, and for the first time in history, giving us useful data for everything filed in the annual and quarterly filings by energy utilities and by oil pipeline companies and by gas pipeline companies. Before we do that, I would love to ask you a bit about some of the work that you did before becoming chairman of the FERC. Then later on, we'll be asking you about how the better use of FERC filing data might have enabled you to save some time in that work.
Certainly, yeah. I've been in the energy sector for more years than I want to admit, over 40 years. Really started out as a litigator in rate cases, both at the state level and then ultimately at the federal level, and actually worked very extensively in state rate cases before state public utility commissions on behalf of a whole array of clients, on behalf of public interest clients, on behalf of large commercial and industrial customers, and had to go into those rate cases often very much at a disadvantage because the utilities are the ones who create the data, of course, and hold the data and retain it. And they did report it out to some extent in these FERC forms that you just discussed, but it was a very flat database in a way that was very inaccessible.
Give us a couple of examples of the sort of information that when you were doing this litigation, you might have needed to pull out of a FERC form.
Well, one of the things that I was always interested in, and any litigator who is representing customers is concerned about how expense items increase over time. It's always very useful to know, are there certain categories where things from year to year are, rising at what would be a consistent level that would be compatible with inflation, or are things, out of the norm in a way that they should be flagged and need further investigation. And that gives you a real insight into where you want to focus your interrogatories, where you want to focus your questions, where you want to dig in. And if you don't have that information, you really are flying blind in those kinds of proceedings. So, that would be one thing that I would do, manually, take numbers and put them in spreadsheets and ultimately utilize them to provide that kind of a data comparison on a time series basis would be one that would be very interesting. Another one, of course, if you're looking at things like, what is the return on equity that you want to look at as an appropriate and reasonable level of return on equity, or the amount of rate base per customer, or other criteria for a particular company, you want to compare that company to its peers. You want to look at peer comparisons and have some understanding of how it relates, how that particular company that you're focusing on with respect to the particular regulatory proceeding, the rate case proceeding that's before you, how it performs in relationship to other, similarly situated companies. And again,
and how would you do that when you were litigating rate cases? How would you create that comparison?
Yeah, and those were extremely tedious and extremely difficult to do. It would take tens and tens of hours to do, and usually you really couldn't do a very effective job because you just didn't have the time or the data in some instances to really effectively do it.
Jon, these two examples strike me as some interesting ones as we consider how FERC filing data is downloaded and analyzed and served back up on the FERC Pro Data Hub. So I'm going to put a pin in both of those. I would love to ask you about your appointment as chairman of the FERC and some of the challenges you worked on during your tenure there, especially with data.
First nominated, confirmed, and sworn in as a commissioner in 2006 at FERC, and I ultimately became chairman in 2009, served until 2013, was the longest serving chairman, at least up to this point in time, longest serving chairman at FERC. And as chair, you're also, interested in similar types of data analysis. Ultimately, you want to know how companies are doing on a comparative basis, especially. You're interested in looking across pipelines and how they're earning, what they're earning, and how those earnings compare to others similarly situated. You want to know similar information with respect to transmission companies that you're looking at, and how the industry overall is doing. Certainly when you're looking at things like incentives for transmission, you want to know what the earnings levels are and how those earnings levels compare across the industry, and whether or not appropriate certain incentives are appropriate, or whether those incentives are actually providing intended results. So there's many uses for the data that is contained in the forms that you mentioned in FERC Form 1, the annual electric form, FERC Form 2, the annual gas pipeline form, the quarterly filings as well. But again, all that data when I was at FERC was all in a flat format. Had to be pulled out manually. It would take staff. If I'd asked staff to do something as far as a comparison across companies, it would take them days and days to report back to me, to provide me with that kind of information. So it was a very tedious process. It's something that you didn't want to ask staff lightly, any of those things. You really wanted to have a very, very solid reason to make a request like that, because you knew you were going to be subjecting staff to many long hours of trying to pull that data out.
I want to ask one question before we head to the specific capabilities of the FERC Pro Data Hub. I want to ask one question about what you learned as a manager. Obviously, as chairman of the FERC, you were responsible for a very large staff. Did you find that your previous experience with some of the tedium of using FERC forms provided you with empathy for those staff that you might ask to perform those analyses?
Well, yeah, no, absolutely. Because, and the reason I really had empathy is because, I used to do those analyses myself when I was a litigator at the state level, or I'd have, but in many instances I was doing those on my own when I was the state consumer advocate in Nevada. We would have limited staff. So, I had empathy and I had real-time experience with the tedium involved in trying to extract and pull out, like pulling teeth, pull that information out of those documents.
Well, for the sake of, as a former government employee on a lower level myself, I'm grateful for the empathy that you showed for those staff that you'd request analyses of when you were chairman of the FERC. I'm going to turn now to the specific capabilities of the HData of the FERC Pro Data Hub, and we'll be talking about some of the specific tools that are available in that data hub. I'm excited to these because our hope is that by downloading the XBRL formatted FERC filing data, putting it into a database and applying analytical tools, we can resolve and address some of the manual labor and some of the hardships that you've described, both the things that you had to do as a litigator and the things that you had to ask your staff to do when you were the chairman of the FERC. We'll start with the comparison tool. As you know, the comparison tool in the FERC Pro Data Hub allows our users, allows energy companies or anybody else to automatically pull up anything from FERC schedules for multiple companies side by side. What are some of the ways in which you could imagine being able to use the comparison tool in some of those previous roles?
Well, the comparison tool, as I mentioned before, would ultimately be very valuable in looking at, comparative expense levels and comparative returns on overall investment for a number of companies in peer groups where you were involved in litigation. But I'll tell you another extremely valuable, I think, use of the comparative tool would be for the companies themselves. Any company, any utility company, I think, would want to know how it compares to its peer group, how it's doing relative to that, and usually and could actually use those markers in lots of ways inside the corporation. It could use it with respect to divisions in the corporation, transmission or distribution or generation group within the division, and based upon those markers, could rank them and rank them in ways that could even be used to provide bonuses and other compensation. So there's lots of ways that I think a utility could effectively use this comparison tool to see how it's doing in relationship to other companies of similar engaged in similar services and of similar size.
As you know, we have 5 tools, so I don't want to spend too much on this one, but I have one other question about the comparison tool. Jon, as you know, the comparisons that the comparison tool does are based on the structure of the FERC forms. Here we have the income statement, the balance sheet. We'll have different financial tables, and the numbers that we see here, we're starting out with numbers that come directly from those FERC forms. However, we also have the capability to add KPIs and calculated fields. In other words, numbers that don't come right from the FERC forms, but that are derived from a calculation combining multiple numbers from the underlying forms. Can you think of any calculated fields that might be useful if they were lined up to compare multiple energy companies across one another if we did that?
Well, I can think of a number of them, and I think there's almost a infinite or unlimited number of comparisons that you could do, but such things as dollars spent per transmission mile, dollars on transmission, dollars of transmission spent per mile, dollars spent per customer. You could look at dollars per spent per customer in different segments. You could look at dollars per spent per customer in the customer service area. You could just take out those expenses. You look at dollars spent per customer overall, total company. There's a number of ways to parse that particular comparison. And those are just the ones that I could rattle off the top of my head, but I think there's literally dozens of other comparisons that can be done that energy companies would be interested in doing, again, to get some kind of, and then once you took that data, then obviously you can compare it to your other peer companies and see how you're doing with respect to those other companies. But you also could compare it in a time series way as well, looking at how that metric is changing over time within a particular company as well. So there's many ways to parse it, that I think could be extremely valuable to an energy company to utilize.
As you know, we are building some of these calculated fields or KPIs right into the data hub so that they will be served up for our customers. And we're using the input that we're receiving from our customers in the FERC professionals group in order to decide what to build right into the data hub. But our second tool allows our customers to, in effect, create their own. The second tool is our API tool, which allows our customers to select entities and select specific terms, that is, specific numbers that come out of the forms, and create their own custom spreadsheet. Obviously, this is a little bit different because you're not starting with the structure of the FERC forms. Instead, you're starting with all the different fields, all the financial numbers, and you're choosing which ones you want. Can you think of any other applications, maybe in rate case litigation or maybe in FERC regulation, where it might be useful just to pull one number or two numbers out and focus on those the way that we've done?
Well, certainly it would be extremely useful in the context of a rate case to, focus on specific numbers that have the most importance in the rate case, whether it be increase in rate base in a particular period, or whether it be, administration and general expenses. But focusing on specific numbers and the ability to drill down on those specific numbers, both in the context of a rate case and even in the context of the utility, the energy company itself, for again looking at how those numbers are comparing over time, I think would be extremely useful.
We'll move to the third tool, the text analysis tool, and this is quite a bit different. The text analysis tool allows our customers to pull up the text of a FERC form. Much of the value from FERC forms comes from the numbers that are reported, but there's also a lot of value and insight to be found in the text descriptions that are part of that form. The text analysis tool allows our customers not just to pull up the text, but also perform text analysis on it. For example, what we're showing right now is a comparison between two different companies, same section, two different companies. Can you imagine what sorts of applications might you find for the narrative disclosures, either in rate case litigation or in FERC regulation?
Well, certainly in FERC regulation and with respect to an energy company, you may want to look at other companies' disclosures and the language that they use with respect to their form over time, how it may change, and they may be things that you may want to incorporate into your filings as well, that you think from a regulatory perspective would be useful to show due diligence, to show to FERC certain perspective that your company is establishing with respect to various parameters that FERC would be interested in. From a rate case perspective, it also could be useful and interesting, again, to look at how a company's language in its FERC Form 1, FERC Form 2, and some of these other forms has changed over time. And those changes related to activities of the company that may in fact flag things that you wouldn't otherwise know about or have an understanding of, that can help you ultimately target questions and target an investigation. And again, on the company side as well, it may looking at how your form is changing over time, bring things to the attention of management they may not even have been fully aware of with respect to certain things that may have happened that they need to pay more attention to.
Thank you. We haven't thought as much about this one because we've been focusing so heavily on the numbers and on calculated fields, but that makes me excited about what we can do to help our customers. The next tool that I want to talk about is the visual analysis tool, allowing an easy way to create visualizations of any numbers, including comparisons between different companies. And one of the functionalities of this tool that I really want to focus in on is that our visual analysis tool allows our customers to create a search, save that search, and then run it again every quarter and automatically take in whatever new filings have come into the FERC and been published by the FERC in that time. What I would like to ask you is if you can think of any instances where it might be useful to be on the same search over and over in new periods without having to recreate it.
Well, certainly, that gives you from a running perspective the ability to have these kinds of visual graphics available to you, and to have, for a company perspective, to show things to the board of directors, to show things to upper management, and show how things are changing within that company in a visual graphic way. And to save those searches, you can go back, each year and go back and just do the same thing and hit the button on the search. You've got the search of what you need to search within this new year and the graphic that you need to create, and it's automatically done for you. So, it's going to help you tremendously in developing those kinds of visuals that, again, a board of directors would be very interested in seeing within a company, and utilizing for board of directors and for senior management. And the ability to save that would be really a fantastic asset, I would think, for any energy company. On the litigation side, certainly any litigator who's working on behalf of consumers and is going to be involved in rate case litigation, to be able to create these kind of graphics for utilization in cross-examination, utilization in exhibits to submit to the commission is going to be extremely useful as well.
Our final tool to talk about is the interactive document viewer. This tool allows our customers to bring up the entire form, any form filed with the FERC in this XBRL format, bring up the entire form in a way that looks familiar, with the schedules arranged just as they are in the PDF or Microsoft Visual Fox Pro version, with one big difference: every number is interactive. Can you think of uses for this? For example, are there any times when it might be useful to see the whole form as one undifferentiated piece and yet have the interactivity?
Well, certainly when, people, both in the energy companies who use these forms and, people who use it on the outside, litigators and regulators and others, are used to seeing the form in its full format. So pulling it up that way and then being able to interact with the numbers individually in the form while you're actually looking at it in the context of the different FERC Uniform System of Accounts numbers in that context is extremely useful, because in this way you can see, well, I'm looking at account 402, and then, well, oh yes, but I also want to do something with respect to account 409, and I've got it right here on the form, and then I can pull those numbers out and ultimately manipulate them in ways that can do comparisons or reviews over time, etc. I mean, it really gives you a much more powerful tool to be able to utilize this data in ways that you never could before.
Our data hub was developed by Idacity, and we were so excited to be able to put it into FERC Pro for the first time in history, offering interactive analysis of the data that comes out of FERC filings, all thanks to the FERC's decisions to adopt XBRL. Jon, do you have any final suggestions for us at HData as we work to make the data hub within FERC Pro as useful as we can?
Well, I think, just the more examples that you can develop, and I know that you are, and I'm helping you work on developing those examples that we can get out there. And the other thing is, I think this users group you've got, asking them for, input and examples is going to be a very powerful thing to ultimately help your current customers and future customers of ways that we can use this tool, because I think we're not even scratching the surface yet. We just got the tool. We're just beginning to use it. And once we start to, the whole user base starts to interact with this tool, it's going to explode, because I think the capabilities are tremendous.
Jon Wellinghoff, CEO of GridPolicy, former chairman of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and advisor to HData. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Hudson. It's been a great pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye now.